Hello everybody, welcome to A British Audiophile. If you're new to this channel and you haven't crossed my path before, my name is Taryn. Do you like old stuff? I love old stuff. Take this house for example. Not that you can tell much from what you can see on camera, but believe it or not, it's an old stable block that's over 650 years old. And that sideboard on your left, my right hand side, it's a little bit too close to that speaker. That's mid-Victorian Gothic, over 170 years old. It's not always easy to get hold of old things that you really love, especially if they're good quality. Take vintage audio for example. In order to purchase some of the more coveted stuff, you either need to have very deep pockets or be on very good terms with your personal bank manager. To tell you the truth, I'm not all that nostalgic. There's a whole bunch of old hi-fi gear that I'd quite happily usher along to the vintage audio afterlife. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there isn't good quality components that have been built over the years. There certainly have been and are all different prices, especially when it comes to analog sources, amplifiers and speakers. It's increasingly difficult to find them at sensible prices. You need to know what to look out for and what you're doing. Perhaps a suitable alternative is to consider some retro chic, and there's a whole plethora of speakers that have been launched in recent years that will give you that warm, cozy, nostalgic feeling. Klipsch have flown the flag in the good old USA with their heritage range of speakers, and over this side of the pond, Tannoy have never really gone away with their prestige and legacy range of products. There's a whole bunch of others that seem to have jumped on the bandwagon as the popularity of these type of designs has grown, from the likes of Ellipson, Wharfdale, KLH and Magnet. JBL perhaps have more right than any to look to their past for inspiration. Their classic L100 speaker is an icon from the 1970s. It was recently rejuvenated to celebrate JBL's 75th birthday with a limited edition model. It's the baby brother to the baby brother of that speaker. Yes, there's an L82 model as well, but it's the L52 Classic that's only just been launched that I'm reviewing today. I'll post a picture up of it in a second, but don't be fooled by the looks. This is a modern speaker in grandpa's clothing. So come on, let's see how I got on. The JBL L52 Classics retail for £999 in the UK. The now iconic Quadrex grills, that are also fitted to the L82 and L100s, are available in dark blue, black or burnt orange. There are no concealed magnets to suspend the grills, just regular mounts, so removing them does require a little elbow grease, a homage to speakers of the past. The cabinet is finished in a real walnut wood veneer. It measures 330 by 197 by 216 millimeters or 13 by 7.7 by 8.5 inches. Each speaker weighs 5 kgs or 11 pounds. The 133 millimeter 5.25 inch mid-woofer cone is constructed of pure paper pulp. The port is on the front. The 20 millimeter 3/4 inch titanium domed tweeter sits in a shallow waveguide for better integration with the mid-woofer, and there's an adjustment to alter the high frequencies to taste. Not much to see on the back, a label so you know what you've purchased, which confirms that the L52s have a sensitivity of 85 dB and an impedance of 4 ohms. Oh yes, one set of speaker binding posts. There's not a huge amount to discuss in this section. We have a two-way speaker with a front port, with the mid-woofer handing over to the tweeter at 2800 Hz. But it does have those offset tweeters, and I've heard a couple of reviewers mention that in the 1970s people didn't understand what they were doing with speaker design, so they just put the tweeter anywhere. That isn't the case. The reason why the tweeter's offset is all to do with edge diffraction, and the physics of that was pretty well understood way before the 1970s when it came to diffraction of waves. So I'll just grab the speaker to demonstrate. Now I'm wired up to this thing, so you just have to bear with me. I'll be back. The reason why the tweeter is offset is all to do with edge diffraction. The dispersion of the tweeter is pretty wide until you get to the top end of its frequency response, so sound travels and reflects off the front baffle. But something interesting happens when you get to the edge. Because there's a difference in impedance between the cabinet and the air, sound is emitted outwards. It's almost like you've got a small tweeter all the way around the edge. Because it takes time for sound to travel, that effect happens with a slight delay. It causes a time smearing, and that can affect stereo imaging and transient response. Now back in the day, it was quite common for manufacturers to have wide front baffles. That was the fashion at the time. And because it takes longer for sound to travel and the delay is more prominent, that time smearing effect is more prominent. So what manufacturers did was they made sure that this tweeter was offset and there was no direct mathematical relationship between the center of the tweeter and the surfaces that surrounded it, therefore spreading out the edge diffraction effect and making sure that that time smearing effect wasn't quite so noticeable. Those good old JBL speakers from the past were known for their dynamic and engaging sonic presentation, and that's pretty much what you get from the L52. It's a little speaker with a big personality. Do you know what? That's pretty catchy. I might put that on the thumbnail. So let's break this down. The bass is strong and it packs a punch. Okay, officially it only goes down to 47 Hz. So if you want subterranean bass and you want to shake the floors, you're going to be adding subwoofers. But if you were blind testing this speaker, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the lower registers come from a larger enclosure. It's not the last word in bass articulation and definition, but it's not bad either. So if you've got John Bonham on there thrashing out a rhythm on his drums, it's not going to turn it into some homogenized mess. The mid-range is what gives the L52s its engaging personality. Now let's not mess around here, it's going to divide opinion. It depends on which side of the fence you sit on. If you sit on this side of the fence and you want a neutral speaker, well, this isn't the speaker for you. But if you sit on the other side of the fence and you want a little bit of embellishment to bring music to life, you might want to pay close attention to what I'm just about to describe. It's not a neutral sounding speaker, it's not what JBL, at least it's not what I think JBL were going for here. JBL is owned by Harman Audio Luxury Group. That's the same team of people that produced the Ravel range of products. Their objective there is clear, to produce a neutral sounding speaker. I haven't reviewed one of them. Hopefully I'll get to do that at some point and find out for myself how close they've come to that objective. I don't think that's what Sean Olive and his team were trying to do with the JBL L52 Classic. I think what they were trying to do was make it sound like JBL speakers of the past. And they've achieved that objective. There's a slight uplift in the presence region. That's between 2,000 and 4,000 Hertz. It's what gives it a slightly forward nature and a little bit of energy. They haven't cooked it too far, so it's going to be sounding harsh and bright. And even with bright recordings, it's not going to make your ears bleed, but enough to make you pay attention. The lower mid-range is full, which gives the speaker a sense of authority, especially with male vocals. I have a whole bunch of tracks that I try out to separate the men from the boys. Mainly blues singers, people like Muddy Waters, John Lee Hooker, B.B. King, Carrie Bell. Here I think the lower mids are overdone a little bit, not all the time, but occasionally there appears to be some kind of stored energy or boxy resonance. It doesn't manifest itself all the time, like I said, but when it does make the vocals sound a little bit too thick and robs the speaker of ultimate clarity. By the way, if you want a great album to test out your system with male vocals, try Muddy Waters' folk singer album, recorded by Chess Records in 1964. It's a stripped back acoustic recording where Muddy Waters also plays acoustic guitar along with Buddy Guy, with Willie Dixon on bass and Clifton James on drums taking care of the rhythm section. Wow, that man, what a voice. Let's talk about the high frequencies. I thought they were very well judged in my room. Now you can adjust them, of course, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next section. But in the standard setting, I felt there was a nice balance between top-end extension and emphasizing detail without going too far to sound overly sibilant and aggressive. The rest of the things that I look out for are generally in the good, but mostly in the very good category, but not quite class leading. There's decent separation from one instrument to the other, even when things get motoring. The leading edges of notes are nicely defined, as well as are the decays nicely rendered, and it throws out a decent soundstage that stretches way beyond the speaker's left and right. And even for a speaker that has a slightly forward presentation, there's a touch of soundstage depth. There's a little bit of vagary about the imaging. It's not quite locked down in every single location, especially when it comes to the center image, but it's nothing really to complain about for a speaker around this price. If you want class-leading levels of detail, retrieval and control, the Amphion Argon 1s would be my speaker of choice. It's a very different type of sonic presentation, let me be clear. It's also a dynamic sounding speaker with a strong amount of bass, but it's faster and tighter in the bass, leaner in the mid-range, which gives it a more analytical type of presentation which suits those type of audiophiles. The sound artist's interpretation of the classic LS35A is another speaker that you could purchase for less than £1,000, which has, again, a very different type of sonic presentation. It is a slightly smaller speaker than the other two that I mentioned here, but it sounds a lot smaller, produces less bass, and is less dynamic, but it does have that LS35A party trick, a very natural and open sounding mid-range that the other two speakers simply can't match. Setup is quite interesting. First of all, you've got that high frequency adjustment. Now where you're going to wind up with it is going to depend on a few factors: the acoustics of your room, your partner equipment, and to some extent your own personal taste. I had it in the neutral position, but you may not. For example, if you've got an acoustically lively space with a lot of hard reflective surfaces or equipment that's on the bright side, you can adjust for it by turning that dial down. The converse is also true if you've got a lot of furniture in your room, especially a lot of soft furnishings or equipment that needs livening up a little bit. It's a nice adjustment to have, and it's on this particular speaker because it's based on a design that dates back to the 1970s when this type of adjustment was common. It's not common on modern speakers, and it's a shame. The Q-Acoustic Concept 300 speakers that I reviewed some time ago use jumpers at the back to make the high frequency adjustment. So it's possible to have that kind of control on a modern speaker without ruining the minimalist clean aesthetic. The L52s have those offset tweeters, so you've got a decision to make. Do you have the tweeters facing inwards or the tweeters facing outwards? I spent quite a bit of time in both configurations, and in the end I decided I preferred them with the tweeters facing outwards. There's a little bit of graininess in the upper mid-range that's smoothed out as you listen off axes. In fact, if you're listening to the speaker directly on axes, that's where you've got the tweeter pointing directly at your ears, you'll be forgiven at times for thinking that you're listening to a horn speaker. It's not unpleasant, it's just a particular type of coloration that you either enjoy or you don't enjoy. But in any case, you can temper it to some extent by listening off axes. Now you might think, why don't you just turn the high frequency adjustment down? And of course that will temper it too, but then you're also rolling off the high frequencies as well. It's a front ported speaker with relatively shallow depth. Normally these type of designs are tuned to work well close to walls. Not so much in this case. It has strong bass output, especially the mid-bass punch, and if you want to maintain reasonable definition, you do need to pull it out a little bit. I wound up with it 90 centimeters or 3 feet from the wall behind it. That's measuring from the front of the speaker, not the back, which is what I always do. If you are placing it close to walls, I'd place a sock in that front port. There were no bungs with the review sample that I had. And that will help to control the low frequencies and attenuate them quite a bit. The first amplifier that I hooked up was the Atl Iron 80 Signature that I just finished reviewing. That's an amplifier that has a big, dynamic, warm and rich presentation. And I have to say that the Synergy gods were smiling. Not only is the Atl appropriately priced, it's similar in cost to the L52s, it pulled back that upper mid-range response into something more neutral whilst playing to all the strengths of the L52s, that dynamic, engaging presentation. Sometimes things just work out great. My Hagel H160 at over twice the price might be considered overkill, and I was concerned that the slight leanness that the Hagel has in the lower mid-range might push the L52s into the realms of brightness. I needn't have been. The L52s are not a lean sounding speaker. They're a full sounding speaker in the mid-range, especially in the lower mid-range, and that balanced out nicely with the Hagel H160. Another very good combination. Just for laughs and to see how much these baby JBLs were capable of scaling up, I hooked them up to my Exposure 21 Pre and 18 Super monoblocks. That was a bridge too far. Those amplifiers are all about unearthing subtle micro details and timbral information. It's not that the JBL L52s are not a revealing speaker. For a speaker around £1,000, they do a good job of pulling out information. But the Exposure just highlighted weaknesses, especially when it came to refinement. I'd stick to amplifiers that are price appropriate, that are either neutral or on the warm side of neutral, and I think you'll be pretty fine to go. They're not a particularly fussy speaker. The JBL L52 Classics are a little speaker with a big personality. Some of you are just going to fall in love with the 1970s styling. If you're looking for a speaker to balance out a slightly dull sounding system, or you've got a fairly neutral sounding system and you're prepared to put some of your audiophile pretensions to one side in order to choose a speaker that injects some life into your recordings without going too far, without sounding bright and aggressive. And that's a pretty neat trick to pull off. The JBL L52 Classics might be just the speaker for you. Now, I'm not slagging off people for having audiophile pretensions. I have plenty of those myself. Spend a lot of time on this channel talking about precise stereo imaging and transient response. Nothing wrong with that. It's hi-fi snobbery that I can't stand. Still, the JBL L52 Classics are not the last word in refinement, overall detail retrieval. I don't think they're intended to be, although they don't do a bad job in that regard. And they come recommended from this channel. My question for you today is, what kind of speakers do you like the look of? Do you like a little bit of retro chic or something with a little bit more of a modern minimalist aesthetic? Please let me know in the comment section what your favorite looking speakers are. So all that remains for me to say is do that social media stuff. Hit the like button, share it if you feel motivated to do so. And if you haven't subscribed already and you want to see this channel grow, please do consider subscribing. Hit that bell notification so you know when new videos arrive. And do check me out on Patreon for my Patreon only content. Join the ABA club where we can speak face to face sometime. And check out some of the consultancy services that I offer. But for today, for now, a British audiophile signing off.